The ship drifted through the broken lanes of an asteroid belt, engines throttled low to mask the heat signature. Its hull bore scars from older runs, carbon scoring across welded patches, mismatched plates from half a dozen scrapyards. Inside, a man sat slouched in the pilot's chair, one boot propped lazily against the console as though he had all the time in the galaxy. The lights of tracking pings strobed across the display, marking the swarm that hunted him. 30 ships in tight formation, each one newer, cleaner, deadlier than his patched-up freighter. Their communications crackled faintly in intercepted bursts, confident voices barking orders in clipped alien dialects. They were closing in like wolves, but the man only smiled, chewing absently on a strip of dried ration as though it were a cigar. He had been in worse corners. Much worse. And every time, those who thought they had him ended up bleeding. He didn't run trade for profit anymore. Cargo was an excuse, a mask for what he really loved, testing himself against those who believed themselves superior. There was a kind of satisfaction in making the mighty stumble, in showing them how fragile their dominance was when met with a species that refused to bow. The aliens had planned this ambush for weeks. He had seen the signs, false whispers planted in the underworld, supposed easy routes broadcast a little too loudly, patrols positioned just out of sight. It was clever, he'd give them that. But cleverness built on arrogance was just another form of weakness, and humans had survived far worse traps than this long before they reached the stars. He leaned forward and flicked a control, letting the comm intercept filter into sound. Their language wasn't perfect in translation, but the tone was unmistakable. The hunters believed the kill was certain. To them, he was already in chains, his ship already stripped, his body destined for whatever dissecting table their analysts used for troublesome anomalies. He let them savor it. "Come closer," he muttered under his breath, voice low and calm. "Just a little closer." He had earned a reputation that reached far beyond the smuggling lanes. The aliens whispered his name in the same breath as threats, warnings told to new recruits. Beware the human with the mismatched ship, the one who never fights fair. They said he was reckless. They said he survived by luck. None of them understood that what they called luck was simply a refusal to play by rules that had never been written for humans. Once, long ago, before he chose this life, he had been nothing special. A dock rat. A mechanic's helper. Another nameless human among billions scattered through colonies barely tolerated by greater empires. He learned quickly that the universe had little use for mercy. Larger species wielded power like a birthright. They assumed endurance came only from their biology, cunning only from their long dynasties. But he remembered Earth stories, the old tales of wars where underdogs carved victory from impossible odds, where persistence was deadlier than any weapon. He made those lessons his creed. He was no soldier, but he was something soldiers feared, a man who turned desperation into strategy, who used every scrap, every chance, every overlooked corner. That was what smuggling gave him, the constant crucible where survival meant creativity sharper than any blade. And now 30 ships bore down on him, eager to prove him mortal. They had no idea they were stepping into his classroom. The first pursuit drones slipped ahead of the formation, sleek spears of alloy bristling with sensors. Their scans rippled over his ship, probing for hidden weapons, for escape vectors. He dialed down his reactor to a faint hum, masking output with the cold rocks around him. On their screens, his vessel looked cornered, sputtering, all but finished. They would think the trap was closing perfectly. They would believe his options had narrowed to none. That was when the real game began. He tapped the comm switch and let his voice bleed across the spectrum, translated into harsh syllables the hunters could parse. "You've been at this chase for hours. Must be tiring, all that coordination, all that fuel spent to catch one man. I hope your commanders think it's worth it, because I can promise you this, you won't like what happens when you finally get your wish." Static answered him, then clipped laughter. The aliens had heard his bravado before. They thought it was the bluff of a desperate smuggler trying to rattle them. He let them think it. Overconfidence was sweeter than any gift, because it blinded them to the hooks hidden in the water. Behind the lazy calm of his posture, Every calculation ran sharp in his mind. The asteroids weren't random cover. He had mapped their drift days ago, memorized their vectors, even seeded a few with surprises. Crude charges rigged from mining explosives waited among the rocks, their triggers coded to frequencies that blended with natural radiation. To an alien scanner, they were nothing but debris. To him, they were teeth waiting for prey. He adjusted thrusters, guiding his ship deeper into the belt. Warnings flashed, collision risk, unstable orbit, but he ignored them. The hunters followed, sure of their superior navigation. They would assume his clumsy vessel could not outmaneuver them. They didn't realize that chaos was his element. As he drifted between tumbling stones, memories rose unbidden. The first time he'd been cornered like this, back on a station near the frontier. For security teams had boxed him in, convinced he had no exit. He'd turned the entire power grid into his weapon, plunging the station into blackout while he slipped away through air ducts. The aliens had called it sabotage. He called it survival. That lesson stayed with him. Never fight strength head-on when you can make strength stumble over its own weight. And tonight, 30 sleek ships were about to learn that one battered human vessel could turn their careful formation into a snare. He killed his forward lights, plunging the cockpit into shadow, lit only by console glow. The asteroid belt loomed like a cathedral of stone, vast and silent, ready to witness the clash. He could almost feel the eyes of forgotten ancestors on him, warriors who had fought with sticks and rifles, guerrillas who had turned jungles into fortresses, rebels who had outlasted empires. He was one more in that line, and though history would never record his name in noble volumes, the aliens who came hunting would remember. On their comms, orders crackled. Close the ring, pin him against the largest cluster ahead. He smiled, because they had chosen the ground exactly as he wished. That cluster wasn't random, it was seeded with his gifts, silent charges tucked into crevices days before. He had steered them with crumbs of rumor, and now they marched willingly into the feast he had prepared. Another message pulsed through the void. Do you know the problem with hunting humans? His voice was smooth, conversational, as though chatting in a tavern. We don't know when we're supposed to quit. You corner a beast that believes in surrender, and it bows. You corner us, and we bare our teeth. That's not courage. That's instinct. The lead alien ship snapped back, voice harsh through translation. They called him arrogant, a petty criminal about to be broken. He chuckled. Maybe. But arrogance is assuming the game ends when you say it does. The asteroids thickened, massive shadows gliding past. His sensors marked their formation. The silence after capture was deliberate, calculated by the aliens to break him. They thought the absence of sound, the weight of waiting, would wear down human nerves. They filled the corridors of his seized ship with squads in polished armor, their boots clicking on steel, their weapons humming faintly with restrained energy. They expected pleading. They expected the kind of despair most prey gave once resistance was useless. Instead, they found him seated in his own pilot's chair, wrists bound, posture relaxed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as though this were an inconvenience rather than the end. He watched their commander, a tall figure draped in metallic insignia, stride across the deck as if already rehearsing a victory speech. They never hid their contempt. To them, he was a scavenger, a parasite feeding at the edges of their order, finally plucked from the shadows. They had spent fleets and weeks to corner him, and now they imagined triumph was assured. He let them enjoy it. Triumph tasted sweetest when it turned to ash. When they demanded codes, he gave them false sequences that triggered nothing but harmless loops. When they ordered him to reveal hidden cargo, he led them through empty holds deliberately scrubbed of anything real. They did not realize that every step they took through his ship was exactly where he wanted them, that every system they accessed had already been tampered with. To them, his cooperation was half-hearted resistance giving way to inevitability. To him, it was the opening act of a play he had written long before they arrived. He began with words, because words were cheaper than bullets and cut deeper than blades when used correctly. He told them stories, not about the ship, not about himself, but about humanity. He spoke of sieges where outnumbered defenders starved but refused surrender, of prisoners who dug tunnels with bare hands, of rebellions that lived on scraps for years until empires collapsed. They dismissed his tales as bluffs, propaganda to keep his spirit alive. Yet he saw how the younger soldiers shifted, how unease flickered when they considered the possibility that he was not lying. He leaned close to one guard and whispered about what humans did when caged, how desperation turned them into predators more dangerous than hunger itself. The guard laughed nervously, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Doubt was the crack he needed. While they searched his vessel, systems began to fail, not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate alarm. Doors jammed slightly. Lighting flickered. Environmental readings fluctuated by fractions. To an untrained eye it looked like age, the wear of a freighter patched one too many times. To him it was the slow tightening of strings already strung. Before the boarding party arrived, he had seeded the ship's guts with time disruptions, subtle sabotage that would build toward something greater. In their arrogance, the aliens tapped into his data core, eager to strip every scrap of contraband record. What they found were deliberately planted files, shipment logs implicating rival species, encrypted messages forged to suggest betrayal among their allies. The smuggler had known greed would drive them to search deeper, and paranoia would bloom the moment they glimpsed shadows of treachery. He could almost hear the arguments sparking across their comms as commanders debated authenticity. Distrust among predators was more dangerous than any weapon he could wield. They dragged him aboard their flagship eventually, parading him through pristine halls of alloy. Soldiers lined the corridors, watching curiously as though expecting to glimpse a legend's humiliation. He gave them none. He walked with shoulders straight, meeting every gaze as if he were the one in command. That confidence unsettled them more than violence could. Predators expect snarling resistance, not the calm of a man who behaves as though the ending is already written in his favor. In interrogation chambers they tried intimidation, demanding knowledge of human smuggling networks. He fed them half-truths and riddles. Each answer gave them something to chew on while pointing them toward false trails. They thought they extracted intelligence. In reality, they devoured poison wrapped in sweetness. Already factions in the fleet would be sharpening blades against each other, convinced betrayal lurked in their midst. Between questions, he observed their systems. The hum of their life support, the cadence of their lights, the rhythm of their guards' rotations, all logged silently in his memory. A man raised among scrapyards and broken machines learned to read more than words. He learned to feel how systems breathed. Where aliens trusted in technology's perfection, he knew perfection never existed. Every system could choke, every circuit could spark. All it required was the right nudge. At last they decided to break him with spectacle. From the viewport of their command chamber, they displayed the captured wreck of his ship, suspended in tractor beams, stripped of dignity. They thought the sight would crush him. Instead, he chuckled low, shaking his head as if at some private joke. "You don't understand," he murmured. "You were never chasing me. You were chasing what I wanted you to find." Confusion flashed among the officers, irritation at his insolence. Yet even as they prepared fresh threats, alarms rippled through the flagship. Minor at first, a cargo bay sealing unexpectedly, a power conduit shutting down, a comm channel locked without command. They thought it coincidence, routine malfunctions. He smiled wider. The seeds he had planted were sprouting. One officer slammed a fist against the console, demanding answers. Another accused rival crews of sabotage. Voices rose, sharp with suspicion. The smuggler sat calmly in chains, watching the cracks widen. He whispered just loud enough to be heard, "You should ask yourselves how many of your friends planned this ambush. And how many planned it a little too well." Paranoia worked faster than any explosive. They began questioning data records, finding the forgeries he had left in his ship's core now mirrored into their systems. To them it seemed as though someone among their allies had been plotting betrayal, feeding the human false routes, maybe even aiding his escape until today. The idea gnawed at them, bred arguments in hushed tones when they thought he could not hear. He savored it. A divided pack devours itself. Then came the first real reversal. Lights dimmed across entire decks, then surged back blindingly bright. Shields flickered. Internal comms dropped to static for half a minute before stuttering alive again. Panic rippled, though officers tried to mask it beneath barks of discipline. The smuggler tilted his head back, eyes half closed, as if basking in the storm. "You think chains keep a man contained," he said softly, almost kindly. "But sometimes chains only tell him exactly where to strike." The flagship trembled as though it were alive and afraid. Bulkheads groaned, consoles spat sparks, alarms screeched in tones not meant to be heard all at once. Soldiers ran through corridors shouting orders that contradicted one another, each convinced the fault lay with some other faction, some hidden saboteur. And through the chaos sat the human, chains still clasped, posture unbroken, gaze steady as if every siren were music composed for him alone. He was not surprised. He had never expected to win with firepower or numbers. He had expected to win by showing the predators what it meant to be prey that refused to die quietly. When the guards shouted at him, demanding explanation, he said nothing at first, letting silence carve its own weight. Then he smiled, a thin curve of lips that unsettled more than a scream would have. "You should worry less about me," he said, voice calm amid the chaos, "and more about who among you wants this fleet destroyed." The words were poison tipped with truth. They looked at each other, eyes narrowing, suspicion flaring. His stories had taken root, his planted evidence now watered by genuine fear. A tremor rolled through the ship. Lights failed completely for 3 long seconds, plunging the deck into total darkness. In those seconds, he closed his eyes and breathed slow, calm, steady. The aliens, creatures bred for order and control, were less serene. By the time lights sputtered back to life, 2 officers had weapons drawn against each other. Discipline cracked like thin ice. He had seen it before. Gangs tearing each other apart when cornered, soldiers blaming comrades when ambushes succeeded. Humans had survived centuries of chaos. They knew how to twist it into survival. The first detonation came not from his hand, but from their own. A power conduit overloaded, rupturing deep in the engineering bay. The ship lurched as systems scrambled to compensate, shields flickering to near nothing for a heartbeat. That heartbeat was all he needed. He had prepared redundancies within redundancies, ensuring that every failure birthed the chance for a greater collapse. Somewhere outside, drifting minds he had seeded earlier recognized the shield lapse and pinged awake. Silent hunters with no engines, no signatures, just shaped charges magnetized to alloy. They began to crawl across the flagship's hull unnoticed. Guards finally tried to move him, yanking chains, barking commands. He walked where they pushed him, compliant, never resisting because resistance would have been expected. It was calm that unnerved them. He knew how they thought. A cornered human should snarl and claw. One who did not might know something they didn't. Suspicion deepened. As they escorted him toward containment, the second rupture shook the vessel. Not sabotage this time, but panic. 2 allied ships fired warning bursts at each other when their captains exchanged accusations. The blasts lit the void, bright enough to be seen through the flagship's viewports. He chuckled. "I told you," he said softly. "You weren't chasing me. You were chasing your own reflection." Containment cells waited, cold and metallic, but they never closed around him. Halfway down the corridor, power died again. Emergency lights stuttered weakly. Doors sealed at random, trapping squads away from their charges. He slipped into shadow with the ease of someone who had lived half his life in ducks and alleys. Chains clinked softly as he moved, but he already knew where the weak points were. He slammed one cuffed wrist against the junction of wall and floor, the precise spot he had memorized when studying their ship's rhythm. The cuff cracked open under force not because of strength, but because he had noted where metal sang weakest. Humans had always been listeners of flaws. Freed, he did not run wild. He stalked. Improvised weapons came easy, a shard of panel torn loose, a piece of conduit wrenched free. When 2 guards rounded the corner, expecting a prisoner cowering, they found a predator waiting. His strike was swift, brutal, efficient. No flourish, no hesitation. He left one alive long enough to whisper, "Tell your commanders, every step you take from now on belongs to me." Terror widened alien eyes before silence claimed them. Word spread quickly that the prisoner was loose. Patrols scrambled. Orders turned frantic. In their desperation, they sealed bulkheads, cutting off entire squads from each other, fracturing their own strength. He moved through the chaos like smoke, unseen until too late, striking where fear was weakest armor. He was no soldier, but soldiers are trained to fight enemies they understand. None of them understood a human who fought like a cornered animal, turning scraps into blades, shadows into allies. Outside, the rest of the fleet faltered. Mistrust thickened into open hostility. Data streams laced with the forgeries he had planted now screamed louder than reason. Captains accused each other of betrayal, of collusion with the smuggler. Weapons powered up, threats turned into volleys. Beams lit the void, and ships that had hunted together began bleeding one another. He needed only to wait. The crawling charges on the flagship's hull finished their patient journey. One by one, they detonated, not in a blaze of destruction but in precise stabs that gutted external comms and weapons mounts. The ship howled like a wounded beast. Inside, he felt the tremor of impact and smiled grimly. He reached the command deck by the time panic reached its zenith. Officers screamed into dead comms, their authority eroded by each failure. He stepped from the smoke-filled corridor, blood streaked across one arm, eyes burning with something that was neither madness nor mercy. They turned weapons on him, but hesitation stalled their fire. Because they realized, too late, that every system crumbling around them had begun the moment they captured him. "You thought the cage was yours," he said, voice steady, cutting through the din. "But cages belong to whoever learns to use them." One officer lunged, desperate to end the humiliation. He sidestepped, drove the jagged conduit into the alien's throat, and let the body fall across controls. Sparks leapt, alarms wailed louder. He advanced, not with the swagger of victory, but with the inevitability of gravity. Each step said what words could not: "You underestimated the wrong species." The fleet outside tore itself apart. Flagship guns meant to command the formation were silent. Signals were broken. Allies fired at allies. And one human, armed with nothing but foresight, will, and contempt for inevitability, walked through the wreckage of certainty like a ghost pulling empires down with every stride.